Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeremy, and I'm a representative of EHN Canada. We are a nationwide network of treatment centers for addiction, trauma, and mental health. We have facilities coast to coast, located in Nanaimo, British Columbia, Calgary, Alberta, Toronto and Peterborough, Ontario, Montreal, Quebec, and Annapolis County, Nova Scotia. We offer high-quality inpatient, outpatient, and online treatment programs. For more information, please visit our website at ehncanada.com. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone is on mute and cameras are off for today's webinar. But please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our speaker. We will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of today's session. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out a follow-up email next week that will include the link to the video, today's presentation slides, any other useful resources, as well as your CEU certificate. Just a reminder, your CEU certificate will be sent out sometime next week. So I am currently in Toronto at our Bellwood facility. Toronto is located on the traditional territory of several nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. It is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. We also have presence in today's webinar located at our Edgewood facility in Nanaimo, British Columbia. They are on the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the traditional territory of the Sununuk First Nation. Vancouver is on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. If you are new to this work and want to find out whose land you are on or grew up on, please check out www.native-land.ca. Many more of you may be physically present elsewhere. I encourage everyone to use the chat function to, where applicable, share whose land you are on. Now, for today's session, mood disorders and habit formation. We have Ryan Slobodian here from our Edgewood facility out in Nanaimo, British Columbia. Ryan has worked in mental health and addictions for the past 7 years. While counseling vulnerable homeless youth and young adults in Calgary, he saw firsthand how addiction and trauma interact and the immense impact it has on people. Working with these survivors, Ryan developed a passion for treatment in this field. He obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology through the University of Calgary and earned a Master of Counseling degree from the City University of Seattle, and also engaged in original research on belongingness and stigma reduction during this time. Ryan is certified in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy and accelerated resolution therapy for the treatment of psychological trauma. He is currently a registered clinical counselor with the British Columbia Association of Clinical Counsellors and a member of the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals, where he is in the process of becoming a certified sex addiction therapist. Please help me welcome Ryan.
Okay, hello. So again, this is always a little weird for me because I'm lecturing usually to a group of people in person. So I'm just staring at my computer. So it's a little odd for me, but we'll get through it. So yeah, I just saw the chat function there, saw a few people from North Bay. I got family in North Bay, so hello. A couple past patients I saw, hello to you, always good to see you. And then some locals and from around the country. So thank you very much for attending, and we're gonna get to it. So the focus of this presentation is gonna be on mood disorders, as Jeremy said, habit formation, and really a little bit of compulsive addictive behavior and nervous system regulation, trauma, and how that all impacts compulsive behaviors and habits. For this presentation, we're going to focus on mood disorders in the sense of, we're just going to focus on anxiety and depression. If we did the broad range of mood disorders, we'd be here quite a while. So I'm just going to focus it on the anxiety and depression. So we're going to go into the etiology of that. We're going to look at how nervous system regulation can impact recovery from mood disorders and addiction. Also, some ways to change habits, and talk a little bit about shame as well. So let's get started here. So what is a mood disorder? So when we look at mood disorders, it's a psychological disorder characterized by the elevation or lowering of a person's mood. So again, for this presentation, just anxiety and depression. There's many facets, bipolar, you name it. So in terms of depression, it's characterized by persistent sadness and a lack of interest or pleasure in previously rewarding or enjoyable activities. So this is somebody who is maybe just not engaging in the things that make them happy, normally would have made them happy. And we'll get to a bit more of how that presents later. And for anxiety, it's characterized as an emotion by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, physical changes like increased blood pressure. People with anxiety disorders usually have recurring intrusive thoughts or concerns. Now the difference is there's an important distinction here, because anxiety is quite a normal thing, and there's really benefits to it. It alerts us when we're in danger. It tells us when to go into that fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode to keep us safe. But persistent anxiety is more about when it becomes persistent over time without a trigger. So that's the important piece, is when there's no trigger, but the anxiety persists. So let's go on here. So really, when we look at, actually, I'm just going to go back here for a second. So an example of that is when and I might have this example later, so I might come back to it, but if you are in the woods and you see a bear, you're going to have anxiety. That's pretty common, I would say. That's a pretty normal response. You can be fear, anxiety, and that's really where it's adaptive. So when the problem becomes is when the level of anxiety remains when there's no bear in the woods and you're just going on your normal day. That's when it becomes problematic. So always a distinction there, because I think anxiety can be really have this bad context to it, but it actually is very adaptive. It's just, again, when it persists longer than usual. So let's get to the etiology of mood disorders. So we always look at the biopsychosocial model. So what we know from research is that there's lots of interactions between the biology, the psychology, and the social factors. Those all kind of are interconnected in a web and can create a clinical presentation of anxiety, depression. So when we look at biological factors, this is this is going to be your genetic vulnerability. We know there are certain genes that predispose folks to basically presenting as depression or anxiety. So that's also going to look like neurotransmitter imbalance, so that your serotonin, that's a common one that I just use. There's usually an imbalance. That's where we look at some sorts of medications. But again, we'll get down to that a bit later. We also know genetically it can affect neuroendocrine functioning. So elevated cortisol or other stress-related hormones. And what we know is there's a dysfunctional somatic response to that. So bodily response. And that also can lead to chronic inflammation and immune system interference. So because of the chronic stress, our immune systems don't function properly, and we're more likely to experience inflammation. So really what we're also seeing in this space is, even though there's biological factors, a common factor in this is this flooding of cortisol and nervous system dysregulation. And that's not to take away from the fact that, yes, medication is very important. And there are definitely biological factors, but what we know about this biological web is cortisol is not welcome in our bodies when it's too much. So we got to watch that. Psychological factors, that's going to be more of your cognitive stuff. So that's going to be your distortions. So I focus on catastrophizing. So, when we think something's going to go wrong before we even know the situation, that's going to predispose a lot of, a negative lens on the world, and it's going to keep someone in a very negative space. And that's really going to affect how they present. So working with thoughts from more of like a CBT perspective, even DBT perspective in this realm, so the psychological realm, is really important. Also, what we know about these cognitive distortions is they come from somewhere, and we usually look at negative core beliefs and shame. So if an example of that, a very simple example, is just this belief, I'm not good enough. That can affect how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, and what we think about the world. So when you're living in a very shameful space, it's very easy to become depressed, very easy to have a negative view and to stay there. We also know about personality factors. So, neuroticism, rumination. So basically this is when somebody is, again, having a very negative outlook on the world, just a very negative personality. And rumination, just tending to think over and over and over again about various aspects of their life, interactions. I mean, we see this a lot actually in social anxiety, where someone will go in for a social interaction, party, whatever it is, and they're thinking about all of how they spoke. Did I mess up? Did I embarrass myself? They'll think about that constantly and constantly. I see that in treatment a lot. It's a very peer-driven environment here, and that can be a really big block, is rumination. What did I say that wrong in group? And that's something we really have to address. So those are, again, this is very broad overview, but this is basically what we're talking about when we look at psychological factors. When we move on to social factors, this is where you're going to see a lot of stuff within a community, within a childhood, development, like I say here, marriage, finances, job. So I will focus on adverse childhood experiences first. So what we know about the ACEs is when somebody has scored high on an ACEs assessment, they are much, much more likely to have depression and anxiety. That is that has been very, very well researched. And that's something we have to look at from a trauma perspective and see if we can really unpack that in a therapeutic environment. And then also chronic stress. So again, tying this idea of chronic stress, cortisol, flooding the system as just a really, it's a predisposition to experiencing depression, anxiety, mood disorders. So, we see, when we look at the attachment research, some of Sue Johnson's work, Levine's work, we know that when there's chronic stress in a marriage, the rates of depression, anxiety go up significantly. We usually see when people enter couples therapy and stabilize a marriage, their mental health usually increases significantly. So, and then that wraps into a lot of other factors. So finances, poverty is very stressful. Maybe there's job stress. And I'm sure as I'm talking, you can all probably think of lots of other stuff that is going to create a lot of stress in life. And again, we could probably spend the whole presentation on just chronic stress. So for the sake of time, I'll move on. And then a big one is trauma and acute life experiences. So this is where I live most of the time because I'm down in our CTAP program, so concurrent trauma and addiction. And I see firsthand how trauma, acute life events really impact basically a presentation of a mood disorder. Now, there needs to be a big distinction in this because when we look at arousal states, Arousal states really mimic mood disorders. So when you look at, and I don't think I include it in the presentation, but when you look at hyperarousal and hypoarousal, they often very much mimic anxiety and depression. So when someone's very hyperaroused, they're very anxious. They can be panicking. There's maybe lots of irritability and anger. And when somebody's hypoaroused, that's when they're kind of despondent. That's when they're hopeless. They might just be sleeping a lot. They're very much shut down. So what that really tells us, I see a lot of people come into treatment who have almost been misdiagnosed as just being depressed, when really their nervous system is very dysregulated. And we actually post-treatment see a lot of basically a reduction in the depression symptoms and anxiety symptoms through the skills they learn here, and through attaching to other people. Insecure attachment is to others, to a partner, to mom and dad, is it's a very big predisposition to mood disorders as well. So you're going to see someone present as maybe very depressed, maybe very anxious in relationships. All can tie back to a lot of the early childhood experiences, attachment issues, and we'll get to that a bit later. And again, that could be a whole other presentation, so I'm going to keep that one short too. Witnessing traumatic incidents. So that's when, we have the big T traumas. So if somebody is, let's just say witnesses a natural disaster, really two things or you're mugged on the street, two things happen. There's a lack of trust in the world that maybe you once had, and your sense of predictability is totally crushed. Those two things are enough to be very avoidant of things, and avoidant can present as depression. So pretty important to make a big distinction on that. And that's something we have to do all the time in treatment down in the trauma program. And that's not to say that folks that come in don't have mood disorders, but it's very important to make sure we have differential diagnoses. Okay, so nervous system dysregulation, mood disorders, and addiction. Okay, so when we look at the nervous system, dysregulation of the nervous system increases stress, and which then increases cortisol. So that's problematic given what we just talked about in the biopsychosocial model and how that interacts. So we know that the social aspect, if there's a lot of stress, dysregulates the nervous system. That dysregulation can touch the biological portion, make genes present. It can do all sorts of things. That inflammatory response that we talked about. So that's really problematic. So we really need to make sure folks are grounded, which we'll get to a bit later. So again, we're biologically and evolutionarily wired to avoid discomfort. So again, that I have that bear in the woods example here. Evolutionarily, we're programmed to not go shake hands with the bear. We're going to avoid it, right? So, but the problem is sometimes through a lot of the experiences I mentioned above, so attachment, traumatic experiences, adverse life events, we can then start to see danger when it's not there, and then that's going to increase avoidance behaviors. That can be addiction, that can be overeating, that can be overexercising, that can be, you name it, anything, any sort of bad habit. Doesn't have to be an addiction. Something is designed to avoid discomfort. So really, when there's no trigger in sight, this is when we're working with the implicit memory system, and we'll get to that a bit later. So moving toward emotional safety and away from discomfort, so fear, shame, and general negative affect, increases the proclivity to engage in maladaptive coping mechanisms, which may become compulsive. So they don't always become compulsive, but really this is where we have to ask ourselves, what's our motivation behind this? And I'll talk more about that later, but really the intolerance of negative affect is a really big central piece to why we still engage in maybe nasty habits we don't want, or the perpetuation of an addictive process. So let's see here. Yeah, so new research, actually exciting new research on addiction, and even if we want to put that into compulsive behavior or habit formation, demonstrates a learning and attachment component to the maintenance of bad habits and compulsive behaviors. So an example of a guy I had in treatment last spring, I believe, he told me about how he first started his addiction. And when I got him talking about how that started, it was very clear that this was very much learned behavior, and how he basically attached to something and regulate his emotions. Described an experience where his grandfather died, the most important person in his life. He felt pretty terrified everywhere else in his life. And when he approached his attachment figures, his mom, his dad, his uncles, with his emotions and his fears and his sadness, they said, hey kid, have a beer. That'll help. And he said, oh my God, it did. And from then on, that was about 12 years old, his brain was anxiety, drinking. It's like one after the other. And relearning all of that was very difficult for him, but he did a fantastic job in treatment. But it's very interesting when we look at that, how that forms, and how at a young age, of course, you're going to do something that keeps you away from all those uncomfortable emotions if you don't have support. We know from Gabor Mate's research and a lot of his wonderful books, there is one thing that's striking in his book, The Realm of Hungry Ghosts. He describes one person who described heroin was like a warm hug from mom. I think that's pretty telling, and leads us to start to question the attachment wounds. So a lot of Sue Johnson's work, Bowlby, Ainsworth, that long history of attachment science. And then, when we look, and then attachment work in terms of addictive process, Philip Flores has a ton of great stuff on that. He has a book on that. One of my colleagues, Alexandra Katahakis out of LA, she does a Center for Healthy Sexuality. She has a book on addiction as an affect dysregulation issue. Fascinating stuff, and helps us kind of rethink what we know. And rethinking is a very big part of changing nasty habits, being open. So we can all fall into traps like that, including myself. Now, so let's see, where am I at here? So compulsive behavior can become an addiction to an arousal state rather than the behavior or substance itself. That's when we look at uppers versus downers. That's a pretty common term when we look at cocaine as an upper, a downer, your heroin, fentanyl, what have you. That's achieving a certain level of arousal. So again, downer being hypoarousal, upper being hyperarousal. When we achieve those states, we can become addicted to how that makes our bodies and our emotions feel. So we have to consider what kind of arousal state is this behavior or substance achieving, and why is that so potent to this person? And that usually gives us good clues to where to start therapy. Nervous system regulation is key to engaging in new habits and combating addiction. I'll say more about that a bit later as to why it's so important, but this is where you have various breathing techniques, DBT skills, nature, exercise. There's various apps that can help with this, health trackers, tracking HRV. Again, I'll get back to that a bit later. And another thing, when we see back to this arousal state, this is why we can see very similar processes in the brain when we look at process addiction, so without a substance being ingested, to substance use. So there's similar cue-induced responses, like there's great research on video game addiction and how it mirrors identically to a cue-induced response when somebody sees cocaine, who's a cocaine addict. Very interesting stuff. And really, when we look at the dopaminergic activity or pathways in the brain, it's very similar. So that leads us to kind of go, what's the common denominator here? So back to the nervous system, it teaches our mind and body a new way to achieve emotional regulation and reduce compulsive behavior. So again, if I'm going back to that story of my client who just basically learned this is how you regulate your anxiety through drinking, that's important to be mindfully aware and be mindfully aware of how various grounding techniques are affecting your body, so you can kind of challenge yourself and say, well, actually, this works too. And how interesting would it be if we taught if everyone taught their kids how to ground themselves, shift emotional states through various techniques. We might be seeing a lot of difference in how they regulate themselves. So that's an interesting piece as well. Let's see here. Okay, going into the shame piece. So there's no, the philosophy I come from, I guess, is there's no shame in what keeps you or kept you safe. So going back to that learned behavior idea, knowing what we know now, bad habits and addiction keep us emotionally safe from discomfort. So there's obviously something going on that has caused somebody to maybe want to shift states that way. And sometimes that feels so good that it becomes compulsive and changes the brain. And the idea is we want to cut new grooves in the brain in treatment and in therapy. We want to show somebody a different way to achieve the state that they were trying to get to, and show somebody a different way to regulate. But in terms of shame, there's no shame in what keeps you safe. So, I mean, if you, like, let's say someone was horribly bullied throughout their development, isolation and, maybe playing video games was a way to disconnect from this very difficult situation in reality and maybe have some decent connections online, but maybe that felt so good it became compulsive. So it worked. But the problem is, maybe fast forward 20 years, that same person is compulsively playing video games 10 hours a day, it's drastically affecting relationships, work, and overall health. That's when we got problems. And the difficult part is, again, actually skipping down, is at one point that was a good choice. So I found that a really fascinating statement by Gabor Mate in his documentary. At one point addiction was a good choice. I thought that was pretty interesting and totally kind of reconceptualizes it. And that kind of goes back to my philosophy of, like, there's no shame in what keeps you safe. It's just not working anymore. It works until it doesn't. That's kind of the old adage in the addiction treatment. So there's no shame. Again, there's no shame to try to get to emotional safety. Again, it's mostly learned behavior on affect regulation. The method just might not be working anymore. So we need to unlearn and relearn practices, and we've spoken on that. So now, I have, obviously, my philosophy is the non-judgmental, non-shaming approach is best practice when working with yourself, supporting a family member, a friend, a colleague, or if you're in the profession, working with clients. Let's see here. I don't love the word disease, but there's no arguing addiction changes the brain, but I think it can be a bit shaming. Okay, so ways to create good habits. So how am I doing for time here? Okay, I got about 15 minutes. So work with the implicit memory system. So I introduced that a bit earlier. The implicit memory system is, when trauma floods the brain. So you may be in one of those situations or adverse childhood experience, whatever it may be, the brain is flooded with cortisol. So what that does is it shuts down the neuroscience behind it is it shuts down the prefrontal cortex, all of the frontal areas of the brain that are designed for executive function, and really what we need to make sense of our experience and code it properly. What happens, though, is when we're so stressed out and flooded with cortisol, we can't use those parts of the brain. So it stays in a very hot center of the brain. It stays in the limbic system. It stays hot, and it's very easily triggered, and it's not conscious. So and what that does, so we fail to encode memories appropriately. So the memories become subconscious, and trauma and shame get triggered maybe without us even knowing in nanoseconds. So an example of this would be, I was working with a guy in the summer. He was terrified of crowds just because of his deployment overseas. He had an incident that happened, very busy. I think it was a bazaar. Anyway, I took him out for an exposure session. We went to a beach. It was very, very busy. And his body was telling him to run. They're, looking at what was going on in front of them. There's kids playing, people are happy, they're enjoying the sunshine, it's nice weather, it's very peaceful, but something about it was telling him something's off. I'm in danger here. Now that's an extreme example, but we can also do this with little things in our lives. And I think it's up to everyone to kind of think, and this is where we have to really distinguish, like, what's really in front of me and what is my body and my emotions telling me, and does that fit? So looking at some of the DBT work around, does this emotion fit the reality? So fact checking, check the facts. A lot of that type of work is great here. And it can help kind of retrain our brains and our memories to go, no, the tiger and the bear is not there right now. It's generally safe. So this is pretty central to nagging habits and avoidance behaviors and addiction, in my opinion. So a common thing I always ask is, what are you avoiding? What's your motivation behind this behavior? So this kind of goes back to this idea, is this habit or is this behavior I'm engaging in shame-based, or is it based on, passion, what makes me happy, and self-care? So think of it this way: if I'm exercising to improve, if I want to exercise, 5 times a week, 3 times a week, whatever it is, why am I doing that? Am I exercising to improve my health, my cardiovascular function, improve my energy, or am I doing it out of fear that I'm going to gain a bunch of weight if I don't? Two very different pieces. And the shame base is often where we see the compulsive nature happen, and the bad habits sticking around. So I encourage people to just kind of check in with themselves about this behavior. Why am I doing this? What's my motivation here? Okay, and then education. So, you need to give yourself solid reasons to shift behavior. So we see this in a lot of the motivational interviewing stuff. So, looking for gains. So working with somebody who's maybe still in quite a bit of denial around a habit. Let's just use alcoholism. Sometimes it can be helpful to go, instead of confronting it directly, kind of moving towards the side and going, look at all this stuff that can happen. So look how much money you're going to save. Look at how your liver is going to be functioning much better. Look at how your overall health is going to change. Those can be those pieces where I think it's actually a good call to change this habit. It doesn't have to be a full-blown addiction to that. Maybe through the pandemic, like we're seeing a lot, drinking is going up, it's increasing. So maybe it's getting to that point of like, maybe I need to shift this and I need to give myself solid reasons why. The other pieces around education and really relearning is this, and education is looking at, some of Adam Grant's work's pretty cool on imposter syndrome versus armchair quarterback, as he calls it. So when we're looking to relearn something, we want to increase our doubt and our humility. So we want to achieve confident humility. So that means what the research kind of shows is this idea that imposter syndrome, while it's very shame-based, oftentimes it can be good because it leads us to doubt, and leads us to learn better and take in more information better. The idea is to become confident and not in our ability to learn new information, not in our stance on an issue. So this allows, so basically I'm confident in my ability to learn and amalgamate new data and rethink various issues in life, not being confident in my opinion being reality and inherently right, or being a part of my identity. I think we see a lot of issues with this in society. So treat habits like a scientist. This is why I like health trackers. And I'll get to that a bit later, but treat it like a scientist. This is what I want to do, and what is the information coming back telling me? So coming at it from that perspective, we can actually take in new ideas and reformat what we're doing. Let's see here. Okay, yeah, so decreasing stress and cortisol production. So again, like as we've been talking, that's pretty important when we're looking at, obviously decreasing stress and decreasing symptoms of mood disorders and really addiction. So, and trauma. Proper nutrition, very, very important. So we know there's a mind-body connection, mind-gut connection, very important to have proper nutrition that definitely affects mental health. I typically try to have some sort of grounding exercise 3 times a day. That can be mindful walking, that can be, balanced exercise, that can be meditation, that can be deep breathing, whatever works. It could be music, whatever works to bring you to regulate yourself. Balance exercise, already said that. Positive social interaction and co-regulation. So attachment science tells us we're wired to connect. So to increase touch, we're a touch deprived culture. Obviously, we have to have boundaries around that. Everyone's different. But what this does is when we can connect to somebody in a deeper way and we can express our feelings and we can let somebody in on what's going on, that's going to release all the good hormones, specifically oxytocin. We're going to see a decrease in cortisol, which is grounding and increases emotional intelligence. So implementing boundaries in unhealthy relationships. So that's an important one. We just talked about how relational stress really dysregulates people. So if there's unhealthy relationships in life, we need to develop coping strategies and implement boundaries. And again, we could talk about boundaries for another 45 minutes, so I won't go off on a tangent there. So identify small areas of your life that cause stress. So, brainstorm how to reduce overwhelm. So what are the little things you could tackle in a day? It doesn't have to be big. And what we know is, I actually might get to that a bit later, so I'm going to wait on that. But find little things that you might be able to tackle. Are you in a place that maybe people can help you out on certain things that maybe you're overwhelmed or stressed? Are there things you need to maybe cut out of your life that are causing you stress? So really just taking a good eagle eye view on what's going on is really important. Health trackers, I talked a bit about this earlier. So this is important in terms of nervous system regulation, in my opinion, because it shows you what works for your body. So when I have mine on and I engage in a grounding exercise, I can put on guided session, I can see how my body responds to it. So if I'm noticing my blood pressure, or if I'm noticing my heart rate go down, if I'm noticing my HRV increase, if I'm noticing my temperature goes up, those are all really good indicators that my nervous system is responding positively to whatever I just did. And back to our scientist metaphor, that kind of gives me information to say that works. And it shows what doesn't work. So when maybe if I eat a bit too late or I exercise too late, my sleep's going to be really affected. And I'm going to see that reported the next day. And that's going to really help me make conscious decisions, which is very important. Mindful, conscious decisions. Is this working for me? Is it not? That's really important. Let's see how I'm doing here. So small steps to avoid the shame relapse cycle. So what we know is bad habits are more likely to reappear if goals are too lofty. So create small goals, create a schedule. That's really important. Stick to a schedule, stick to a routine. It can be as simple as waking up, 10 minutes earlier, 5 minutes earlier, whatever it is. What we often see is way too big of goals, and we can get caught up in the shame release cycle or shame relapse cycle. So this is I guess we'll use maybe exercise as an example. So sometimes what I see in the new year is I'm gonna exercise this, and 2 times a day, and I'm gonna eat well and all this stuff. And again, going back, is that coming from a place of shame and fear, or is that coming from a place of genuine want to improve lifestyle? And if it's coming from a place of shame, oftentimes people dive right in way too quick. And then what happens is inevitably, because we're all not perfect, we slip up, and that's okay. But then the shame just piles on and piles on. Whereas if we create little steps, we can achieve mastery and gain more confidence. And what we know is that leads to bigger goals down the road. So, have patience with that. Accountability groups are really big. So everybody needs somebody to keep them accountable. Everybody needs support. We can't do this life alone. There's too much stress and too much crap going on in the world right now. We need somebody to support us. It's very important. We're a culture that kind of prides ourselves on self-reliance and overworking, but really, when we look at a lot of the research, it's actually good to be dependent on people sometimes. We look at Robert Weiss's work on prodependence, so getting away from that language of codependence. It's okay to balance like being successful as an individual with needing support sometimes. It's very healing. It can tackle mood disorders. It can tackle trauma, addiction. So group processing, accountability groups are huge. Fitness goals even are generally better achieved when there's a workout buddy. You have somebody to keep you accountable. And the last thing is, attend therapy. If you need a bit of direction, there's the therapy is there to help understand, process, and change negative patterns. Maybe you're kind of just stuck in a rip current, and you're just kind of getting pulled out to sea, and you're just fighting against it. You don't know why something keeps happening, and sometimes it just takes a trained professional to help people dig around there, figure out what's going on. And let's see, and that's it. So I think I'm about 2 minutes early, Jeremy. So maybe we can open up to question and answer. So yeah.
Of course. Thank you so much, Ryan. Just to echo what everyone's saying in the chat box, everyone's talking about how you should go into becoming a professor because you're so well spoken and informative.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and then people are saying that they're so excited that you're back for presentations. They've attended your presentations before. We should utilize you more, all this kind of stuff. So obviously that's why we're so happy to have you back and love working with you for this reason, for sure.
Would love that. Thank you very much. Appreciate the feedback.
Awesome. Yeah, and then so lots of questions, which is great. So to start off, can you distinguish between depression and major depressive disorder?
So major depressive disorder, I have the DSM on my bookshelf there. I probably could dig it out, but off the top of my head, I don't know the difference. I imagine major depressive disorder is more likely persistent over 6 months, and depressive symptoms are maybe less persistent. So maybe there's pockets of it. I believe that's a big distinguishing factor, but I'd have to double check.
Again, I'm not a clinician or anything, but we had a webinar 2 weeks ago, which is available on our website as well, with Dr. Tim Ayaz, who spoke about major depressive disorder specifically. And I think you're on the right track for sure about the longevity about symptoms. So I think there's obviously a little bit more to it as well, but that presentation will speak to major depressive disorder too. It's available on our website, as I said, under the resources page. So how would you describe the difference between stress and anxiety?
Stress and anxiety. Okay, so I would say stress is quite normal to have. If we look at a lot of the social issues in society right now and people who are wrapped up in them, like, of course you're going to be stressed. It's a very normal reaction. And it's also very normal because of that stress to be anxious about your future. Again, depression we can distinguish depression, I'm living too far in the past, and anxiety, I'm living too far in the future. So I would say for me personally, stress would be what's happening to me right now. And this is too much. And then my anxiety is, how is this going to affect me in the future? What's my life going to be like? And then worrying about that. That's how I would distinguish it. But I'm sure other people have different outlooks too.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And then a lot of people in the chat box too are saying major depressive disorder is the clinical term.
Right.
Like just a common differentiating. So that gives some insight for that for sure.
Thank you.
So this question kind of comes up a lot in terms of all of our presentations recently, and it's about adoption. So how does adoption play into attachment disorders or mood disorder?
Yeah, that's a pretty complex one. What we know is right from birth, it's very important to have as Sue Johnson would say, like the acronym R, so ARE, somebody who's attuned, responsive, and engaged with us. That shows us that someone's going to be there to regulate our emotions when we're in distress and answers a very central question of, are you going to be there for me when I need you the most? So again, that's the R acronym. But I guess to answer your question, I mean, I actually have a very good friend and colleague who was adopted at a very young age and is doing he does extremely well. He's had a very supportive upbringing, went to a very loving home, and that really what we know is our attachment to style is not consistent over time. So even if you had a secure attachment when you were young and you enter a very abusive relationship, that can shift attachment from secure to insecure. And then likewise, it can switch it around. So if you came from, let's say somebody was adopted at 2 and then maybe had a very insecure attachment, what we know is someone's very attuned, responsive, and engaged. That can really, I guess, shift the style from insecure to secure. So I think sometimes people can conceptualize adoption as this doom and gloom, and someone's going to be, maybe dysregulated for the rest of their life, have relational issues, insecure attachment. But that's actually not what we see. We see that it can change over time. So I hope that helps answer that question.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's going to end up becoming a future webinar topic because there's been so much interest in terms of adoption specifically. Mm-hmm. So it's like these kinds of things are so insightful for my end to know what is a topic of interest. So thank you for that. And then there are quite a bit of questions about the health trackers that you spoke about, and people are just wondering what specific ones do you use?
So again, and I'm not getting paid for this. FYI, I use an Aura ring. So that's basically, it's just like a ring on my hand. It keeps track of my temperature. It keeps track of how I'm doing. It gives me readiness for the day. I can do, like I say, the most important piece for me is I wanted to move away from something that's so like fitness based and go, and just something that's going to get me in tune with my body a bit more, because sometimes I think a lot of us can detach from it a bit. So it kind of just tells me, okay, I do want that pizza late at night. My body's not going to respond to that very well. So, and my sleep's going to suffer. So I use the Aura ring. You can do, Fitbits also track HRV. A lot of the research is coming out now as HRV is like one of the most important indicators on how your body is doing. So in terms of how stressed it is, whether that's physically or emotionally. So as long as it tracks HRV, I would say that's great. I think Apple Watches do it too.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Appreciate that. And then people are sharing the Aura Ring link in the bio. So, in the bio. I'm talking like an influencer now. I meant in the chat. You said sponsored. That's where my mind went. So
I'm not sponsored by them.
Yeah. Hey, we never know. Maybe a potential partnership in the future. But so is there any specific therapy or a focus group at the community level that would kind of pertain to this topic?
Yeah, there's so the more and more that I look at support groups, the more and more I see that there's a support group for almost anything. So really, it's just, I don't know specific ones because there's so many. Like I know there's ones for like betrayal bonding. There's some for anger. Like if somebody gets caught up in an anger cycle, they're these kind of taking from that Alcoholics Anonymous template, and you see like Anger Anonymous and Codependence Anonymous and all this kind of stuff. So I would say just Google search it in your area. If there's something that connects to you, and it doesn't even have to be like an anonymous group. It can be just like, if I think fitness is a topic we're on. If you're joining a group, they have those meetup apps. You can go hiking. You build connections there. So there's various apps now that I guess would help with that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so you've alluded to two of the three universal basic needs in self-determination therapy. If you have an opinion about this, how might the role of autonomy influence habit formation?
Yeah, autonomy is huge. It's a fine balance, right? Like we need to have autonomy to basically have a good, solid sense of self. We need to have a solid sense of self separate than others, but also know in our heads that we can return and attach to somebody to support us. So I often see this a big issue in my enmeshment work. So when I'm seeing somebody who is very enmeshed or attached or fused to a family of origin, or in a marital relationship, I'm usually working with mother enmeshed men. So working kind of with Dr. Ken Adams with that. He has a couple books on that. That can seriously affect somebody forming habits that make them happy, because there's this psychological fusion and connection to, but what would that person think if I did this? And that really impacts someone's individuality and autonomy and can keep them stuck. So that's actually a pretty good point. And there's definitely some Ken has great enmeshment books on that. Visit his website. But yeah, definitely pretty big in becoming your own person and doing what you love.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. So in the biopsychosocial model, have there been any studies about the effect that social media has on an individual?
Oh yeah, tons. Yeah, tons of studies on that. We're even seeing like Instagram, for example, putting in. I think they experimented with hiding how many likes somebody has, right? And we're in when we sometimes engage, if we're not mindful about it, engage in like comparisons on these sites. I guess I'll strictly speak to Instagram, because that's some of what I've seen. If we're constantly comparing ourselves, we're living in this place of shame, is like, I don't measure up, I'm not enough. And then we can start to minimize our gratitude for what we do have. And if we live more of in a place of self-deprivation, not gratitude, yeah, big issues on mood disorder, even substance use, process addictions. The shame is just a really nasty thing. So yeah, huge issues.
Yeah, and like you said, Instagram did do like a pilot project now, and I think you now have the choice if you want your likes to be displayed or if you don't want it to be displayed. So I think they're trying to push it like to the individual user now, but
Yeah.
it's still, like you said, the constant comparison is very defeating, and it can definitely heighten these types of disorders.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think recently there was somebody, I forget her name, came out as a whistleblower on Facebook and said basically how destructive the platform is to basically like kids and just people in general. So yeah, it's definitely a huge issue for sure. Glad you brought that up.
Yeah, a lot of people are talking about Facebook, like, I mean, just on social media as a whole. I've
Yeah.
seen a couple of TikTok videos of them outing Facebook and their not so constructive habits, but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
a different presentation.
I could do a whole presentation on shame and social media. So there you go, Jeremy. Maybe we can do that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, there you go, another potential topic. So everyone wants more presentations from you. So we already have 3 topics now, so that's great.
Let's do it.
Perfect. And then there are questions about, again, support groups, but do you know of any free online DBT support groups?
I don't actually. I'm sure there are, but I don't know of any off the top of my head.
Okay.
You know what I actually did my thesis on Reddit and mental health groups on Reddit. That would be a good place to start. There's pretty much any sort of subreddit on mental health. They have anxiety, social anxiety, they have OCD, they have trauma, they have SAA, so Sex Addicts Anonymous. They have everything you can possibly think of. So good place I always suggest people start is looking on Reddit. And if going into person and meeting new people can be problematic, they have a chat function, they have Discord. They have a lot of great stuff on there where you can just, even hearing somebody's story that is similar to you,